The laughter felt like shards of glass in her throat. Arya stood frozen at the edge of the grand hall, the weight of 1,000 ancient eyes pressing down on her, the silk of her wedding gown suddenly a shroud. Every whisper was a blade, every polite smile a mask for contempt. She had practiced this posture for months, chin high, spine straight, a perfect queenly grace. But now it was the only thing holding her together as the foundations of her new life turned to dust beneath her feet. She searched for his face in the glittering sea of the royal court. Her husband of 3 hours, King Damian Valamont. He was there, by the gilded throne she was meant to share, lifting a crystal goblet of blood wine to his lips. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea she had once longed to drown in, were unreadable. He saw her. He had to see her. He had to hear the venom in his sister's voice, the casual cruelty that dripped from her words like poison. Arya was a vampire of a common bloodline, a fact she had never been taught to be ashamed of until this very night. Damian was the eternal king, his lineage a pure, unbroken thread stretching back to the first night. She had believed their love was a bridge between those two worlds, a testament to something stronger than ancestry. What she did not yet know, what she would only piece together in the long, bitter years that followed, was that the bridge had been mined before she ever set foot on it. Queen Rose had never opposed the marriage itself. She was far too shrewd for that. Blocking the wedding would have turned Damian into a romantic rebel, a lovesick king defying his mother. The court would have rallied behind him out of sheer sentimentality. No, Rose had let the wedding happen. She had smiled through the ceremony, worn a gown of pale gold, and toasted the happy couple with exquisite grace. Her objection was never to Arya's presence, it was to Arya's influence. The deal she had struck with her son was elegant in its cruelty. Marry your commoner if you must, but she will be ornamental, not political. She will sit beside the throne but never touch it. And if anyone in that court questions her fitness to be there, you will let them. You will not defend her. You will let the court establish on the very first night exactly where your little bride stands in the hierarchy. Damian, who had spent 3 centuries holding his fractured kingdom together with political compromise and sheer stubbornness, had accepted the bargain. He told himself it was temporary. A single evening of cold shoulders, and then he would bring them around, slowly, diplomatically. Arya was strong. She could endure one bad night. He would make it up to her. He would spend the next century proving his family wrong. He was right about one thing. She was strong. Just not in the way he expected. But that ugly arithmetic was hidden from her now. All she saw was her husband's silence, and it was deafening. The narrative began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Princess Vespera, Damian's younger sister, had glided towards Arya, her own gown a shimmer of obsidian that seemed to drink the light from the grand hall. Vespera was not stupid. Vespera was, in fact, dangerously intelligent, and her cruelty had the precision of someone who had been studying the art of the social kill for 300 years. She did not insult Arya. That would have been crude. Instead, she complimented her. "What a lovely gown," Vespera said, reaching out to touch the hand-spun silk, the delicate seed pearls Arya's own mother had spent a year sewing into the bodice. Her fingers lingered on the fabric with the tender care of someone handling something fragile and old. "Is this the Ashford weave? My grandmother had a set of bed linens in this exact pattern. She was very fond of them." A pause, perfectly timed. It's so refreshing to see someone honor the old domestic crafts. The courtiers nearby heard every word. Vespera hadn't called the gown cheap. She had called it charming, the way one calls a child's drawing charming. She had placed it, gently and precisely, in the category of things that are admired from a safe distance by people who would never wear them. Arya felt the heat creep up her neck. She understood the game. She simply hadn't expected it to begin so soon. "You're very kind, Vespera," she replied, keeping her voice light. "I'll be sure to pass your compliments to my mother. She made every stitch." Did she? Vespera's eyes widened with a warmth that stopped several degrees short of her pupils. How wonderful. Family is so important. She leaned closer, conspiratorial, sisterly. You must tell me all about your family's traditions. I find the customs of the outer provinces fascinating. Damien never tells me anything." It was masterfully done. In 30 seconds, without a single unkind word, Vespera had established Arya as a curiosity, a quaint artifact from a lesser world that the princess found interesting, the way one finds interesting a beetle preserved in amber. The courtiers' smiles were polite, attentive, and merciless. They understood. Arya's gaze flew to Damien. He was watching the exchange from across the hall, goblet in hand, his expression pleasant and untroubled. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Nearby, she caught a fragment of hushed conversation between two ancient lords, Lord Aldrich of House Ashbourne and his companion, their voices low and unhurried. "Quite pretty, the new queen," Aldrich murmured, swirling his goblet. "Her mother's line connects to the Sunstone clans, I'm told. The mountain families." His companion raised an eyebrow. "Useful connections, those. If one were in the business of hauling ore." A delicate pause. "I suppose the king sees something we don't." Aldrich's smile was thin as paper. He always has been sentimental. Arya filed the words away without understanding their full weight. The Sunstone clans. A loose alliance of common-blood vampire houses who controlled the mountain passes south of Valamont. Her mother's mother had been born among them, before she'd crossed into the lowland cities and married a vampire of modest means. It was a piece of her heritage she'd never thought twice about. She did not yet know that those clans controlled the passes that fed half of Valamont's trade routes, or that a marriage alliance with her bloodline could have secured the southern border for 1,000 years. She did not yet know that the very thing they dismissed would be the thing that destroyed them. Then came Rose. The Queen Mother did not glide or sweep or make an entrance. She simply arrived, the way weather arrives, a shift in pressure that everyone felt before they saw the cause. She was tall and angular, her beauty the kind that centuries had refined into something architectural. She did not need to be cruel. The court arranged itself around her like iron filings around a magnet, and their arrangement told you everything. She stopped before Arya. The nearby chatter didn't die, it adjusted, dropping to that particular register where people pretend not to listen while memorizing every syllable. "My dear," Rose said, and her voice was warm. That was the worst part. It was genuinely, convincingly warm. The voice of a mother welcoming a daughter. She took Arya's hands in hers and held them. "The vow is made. You are family now." She smiled. "I want you to know that you will always have a place here. We will take such care of you." The emphasis was barely there. A feather's weight on the word care. But Arya heard it, and the court heard it, and Rose knew they heard it. "We will take care of you. Not you will take care of us. Not you will rule beside him." The Queen Mother had just defined Arya's role in front of every ancient house in the kingdom, and she had done it while holding her hands and smiling like a saint. Arya was to be cared for, kept, tended, managed, a beloved object, not a partner, not a queen. Rose released her hands with a gentle squeeze and moved on, leaving behind the faint scent of night-blooming jasmine and the absolute certainty that Arya had just been put in a glass case, gently, with the lid clicked shut. And in that moment, the love she felt for Damien, a vast and luminous thing that had filled her entire world, began to curdle. It turned sour, then bitter, then cold. She looked at him, a desperate, silent plea across the marble floor. "Say something, please, for me, for us." He met her gaze. For a single, stretched second, the world held its breath. She saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of conflict, a ghost of the man who had courted her in secret, who had sworn her blood was the most precious thing he had ever tasted. He had told her his family was traditional. He had warned her they might be reserved. He had not warned her that their warmth would be the most sophisticated weapon in their arsenal, and that he would stand by and watch them smother her with it. He raised his goblet again, the ruby liquid catching the light of the chandeliers. He took a slow, deliberate sip. And in that gesture, in that small, simple act of turning away, her world shattered. The silence was his answer. It was his choice. He had chosen his mother, his sister, his court, his ancient bloodline. He had chosen everything that was not her. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, felt toxic. She could taste ashes in her mouth. The pearls on her gown felt like stones, dragging her down. She wanted to run, to scream, to tear the dress from her body. But she was trapped. Trapped by decorum, trapped by the vows she had just spoken, trapped by the hopeful, foolish love of the woman she had been an hour ago. So she stood there, an effigy of a queen, and smiled. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. She smiled as Vespera preened, as Rose held court, as the ancient vampires of the Valamont line looked through her as if she were made of glass. And through it all, she watched her husband. He mingled, he laughed, he accepted congratulations. He performed the role of the king flawlessly. He just refused to perform the role of her husband. Every moment was a new lesson in the vocabulary of exclusion. A duke bowed and asked, with seemingly genuine interest, whether she had traveled far for the wedding, as if she were a guest, not the bride. A countess touched her arm and said she must find the adjustment overwhelming, offering to send a lady-in-waiting to help her learn the protocols, her kindness indistinguishable from pity. A group of ancient lords fell silent as she approached, then resumed their conversation a beat too late, on a different topic, with smiles a shade too bright. None of it was cruel, all of it was lethal. Each interaction was a fresh paper cut, and the salt was in their politeness. And with each one, the ice in her veins spread, freezing the hurt into something harder, something colder, something that would, in time, become strength. She remembered his promises, whispered in the moonlight of her family's humble garden. Your blood is life, Arya. It's not common, it's real. He had kissed the inside of her wrist, a gesture of profound intimacy. With you, I feel alive for the first time in 1,000 years. My court? They live in the past. You are the future, our future. Lies, all of it. Or perhaps he had believed them then, in the safety of the shadows. But here, under the impossibly bright lights of his own legacy, the truth was stark. He was a king first, and a man second. And a husband? He was not one at all. The reception dragged on for an eternity. Each minute stretched into an hour, each polite nod a monumental effort. She was an island, adrift in a hostile sea, and the lighthouse that had promised her safe harbor was dark. When the time finally came for the king and his new queen to retire, a collective knowing sigh seemed to pass through the court. The performance was over. Now came the consummation. The final seal on the bargain. Damien approached her then, the first time he had come near her since the ceremony. He offered his arm, his face a carefully blank mask. My queen, he said, his voice a low murmur that was for her, yet felt as public as his mother's pronouncement. She placed her hand on his arm. His touch, which had once sent fire through her veins, was cold. She felt nothing. The void inside her was absolute. As he led her from the great hall, the courtiers bowed. Arya did not look at them. She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the ornate doors, her mind already doing arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of grief, she would have years for that. The arithmetic of escape. How many guards patrolled the east wing? Whether the servants' corridor near the kitchens connected to the outer wall? The name of the stable hand who had smiled at her, genuinely smiled, when she'd arrived 3 days ago. A woman who had been abandoned by love could afford to weep. A woman who intended to survive needed a floor plan. The bridal chamber was a masterpiece of opulence, a room designed to impress and intimidate. A vast bed, draped in velvet the color of dried blood, dominated the space. A fire crackled in a hearth carved from black marble. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive oils and old stone. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and it felt like a tomb. Damien closed the heavy oak doors, the sound of the latch clicking shut echoing in the silence. The noise of the reception faded to a distant murmur. They were alone. He released her arm and walked towards the fireplace, his back to her. He stared into the flames, his posture rigid. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. This was his chance. This was the moment he could turn, could explain, could beg for forgiveness, could rage at his family, could do something to prove he was the man she had fallen in love with. "They are of another time," he said finally, his voice quiet, strained. "Their ways are not our ways. They will learn to accept you." Arya felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her chest, and she choked it back. It would be a terrible, ugly sound. Learn to accept her? After being publicly branded as a genetic stain on his perfect family tree? He spoke of it as if it were a minor breach of etiquette, a spilled glass of wine. "And you, Damien?" she asked, her own voice startlingly clear, devoid of the tremor she expected. "Are you of another time as well?" He turned then, and she saw the conflict in his eyes again, closer now. He looked weary, ancient. "I am their king, Arya. I must keep the peace. My mother, she holds the loyalty of the old houses. Vespera is thoughtless. It was just words." "Just words?" The porcelain mask finally cracked. "Your mother held my hands and told the entire court that I would be cared for, like a lapdog being given a cushion. Your sister turned me into an anthropology exhibit. Every lord in that room smiled at me the way people smile at something they've already decided doesn't matter. Was that all just words?" She took a step towards him, her hands clenched at her sides. The carefully constructed queenly grace fell away, revealing the raw, wounded woman beneath. "I did not ask you to go to war for me, Damien. I did not ask you to disown your family. I asked for you to stand by me. I asked for the man who swore my blood was his future to show them that it was. I looked at you, and you looked away." "I did not look away," he said, and there was real conviction in his voice, the conviction of a man who had rehearsed this defense so many times he believed it. "I was managing the situation. You don't understand how the court works, Arya. If I had stepped in, if I had publicly corrected my mother or silenced Vespera, it would have been worse. It would have confirmed that you needed protecting. It would have made you look weak." "It would have made you look defiant," she said quietly. Something shifted in his face, a tightening around the eyes. He turned back to the fire. "That's not fair." "Did you make an arrangement with your mother, Damien?" The silence that followed was its own answer, but he filled it anyway. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." Her voice was very steady now. "She allowed this marriage. She smiled through the ceremony. She's never done anything without a reason in 500 years. So what was the price?" "There was no price," he said, and the way his shoulders stiffened told her everything his words refused to. "My mother has her views. I have mine. I married you, Arya. That is the statement. The rest is politics. It will settle." He believed it. That was the devastating part. He had genuinely convinced himself that the deal he'd made, whatever its exact terms, whatever quiet understanding had been reached in his mother's chambers, was not a betrayal, but a tactic, a temporary concession, the first move in a longer game that would, eventually, prove everyone wrong. He could not see that the game had already been lost the moment he agreed to play it on his mother's board. Arya stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, at the king who could not bring himself to name the thing he had done. He would never admit it, not tonight, not in a century. He would reframe it, soften it, bury it under layers of political logic until it looked like wisdom instead of cowardice. And she understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she could not teach him to see it. She could only decide whether to stay and watch him not see it, year after year, in a palace where she would be cared for like a beautiful, silent thing. The last embers of her love died in that quiet, undramatic moment, not with a shout, but with the soft click of understanding. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to save. He wasn't a monster. In a way, that would have been easier. He was a man who had done something unforgivable and lacked the courage to call it by its name. "I see," she said, and the coldness in her voice made him flinch. She began to unfasten the pearls at her throat, her fingers moving with a steady, deliberate calm. "I see everything now." She slipped the heavy necklace off and laid it on a polished mahogany table. Then came the diamond earrings, gifts from him. They clattered softly on the wood. She moved to the intricate fastenings of her gown, the one her mother had poured her love into. It felt tainted now, a costume for a role she refused to play. "Arya, what are you doing?" he asked, taking a step towards her, a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes. "I am undressing, husband," she said, the word husband a bitter irony on her tongue. The heavy gown slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet in a whisper of silk. She was left in a simple linen shift. She felt lighter, freer. She reached for the plain wool cloak she had spotted hanging on a hook by the dressing screen. A servant's cloak, probably left behind during preparations. Practical. Warm. Hers now. She walked to the dressing table and looked at her reflection. A stranger looked back, her eyes hollowed out, her face pale. She saw the heavy, ornate wedding ring on her finger, a circle of gold and diamonds, a promise of forever. She twisted it, the metal cold against her skin. With a final, wrenching pull, she slid it from her finger. She turned back to him, holding the ring out in the palm of her hand. "You speak of bloodlines and authority," she said, her voice even. "This ring, this title, this room, this is all part of that. It is not part of me. I will not be a weakness you have to manage. I will not be the quiet, smiling shame you hide in your castle." "Don't be so dramatic," he snapped, his fear making him cruel. "Where would you even go? You have nothing." Her lips curved into a smile, but it held no warmth. It was a sharp, broken thing. "Oh, Damien," she said softly, "you are so wrong. I have everything you seem to have misplaced. I have my dignity. I have my self-respect." She closed her fingers around the ring. "And I have my freedom." She placed the ring on the mahogany table beside the pearls and the earrings, a neat little row of surrendered shackles, and pulled the servant's cloak around her shoulders. She had mapped the route in her head during the reception. The east corridor led to the kitchens. The kitchens had a service passage to the outer courtyard. The outer courtyard connected to a gate used by delivery carts, guarded by a single sentry, who, based on the empty bottles she'd noticed stacked behind his post during her arrival tour, would be half drunk on spiced mead by this hour. She walked past Damien, towards the doors. He just stood there, stunned into the same inaction that had condemned them. He watched her go, his face a mask of disbelief. Some part of him, the arrogant, royal part, simply could not fathom that she would actually leave. Where would she go? She was a common-blood nobody. She needed him. He was still calculating when the door clicked shut. Arya moved through the palace corridors with the unhurried calm of someone who belonged there. A servant's cloak, a confident stride, eyes cast slightly down, the universal camouflage of the help. 2 guards passed her without a second glance. Why would they look twice? No one escapes into a servant's uniform. The kitchen was warm and loud with the clatter of post-reception cleanup. She passed through it like a ghost, nodding once to a scullery maid who barely looked up from a mountain of dishes. The service passage smelled of old stone and root vegetables. The delivery gate was exactly as she'd predicted. 1 guard, 1 chair, 1 impressive collection of empty bottles, and the gentle rumbling snore of a man who had celebrated the royal wedding with considerably more enthusiasm than the bride. The night air hit her face like a slap, cold and clean and free. She stood outside the palace walls for 3 full breaths, feeling the enormity of what she'd done settle into her bones. Then she started walking. Not running. Running attracted attention. Walking, 1 foot in front of the other, into the vast and terrifying darkness, with no money, no name, no plan beyond away. For the first time in months, she could finally breathe. She did allow herself 1 small private indulgence as the palace lights shrank behind her. She laughed. It was a raw, broken sound, half sob and half genuine amusement, and it echoed off the empty road like a confession. "Well," she said to no one, pulling the stolen cloak tighter, "at least the dress was paid for." The first years were the hardest, and Arya refused to romanticize them. There was no montage of graceful reinvention, no cinematic sequence of a beautiful woman gazing pensively out of rain-streaked windows while learning to be strong. There was hunger. There was fear. There was a 2-month stretch in a coastal city where she slept in the crawl space beneath a tannery because it was the only place that didn't charge rent, and the smell was so catastrophic that even the rats had standards. She learned the brutal difference between solitude and loneliness, and she learned it in the least poetic way possible. Alone, in the dark, smelling like the underside of a cow. But she also learned that she was harder to kill than she'd imagined. Not just physically. Vampires were durable by nature, but in some deeper, more stubborn way. The part of her that had smiled through an entire evening of humiliation, that had mapped an escape route while her heart was breaking, that had walked past guards with nothing but a stolen cloak and an absurd amount of nerve. That part of her was made of something that didn't bend. She shed the name Valamont first, then Thorn. She became simply Arya, belonging to no one, which felt less like a loss and more like removing a splinter. She drifted through the lesser cities, the sprawling vampire settlements far from the gilded courts where no one cared about bloodlines as long as you paid your rent on time. She cleaned. She waited tables in blood-wine halls. She spent 1 deeply educational year as a debt collector for a merchant consortium run by a sharp-tongued old vampire named Marta, who had survived 4 centuries by being meaner than anyone who owed her money. The job taught Arya more about economics, negotiation, and creative profanity than any university ever could. "You're wasted on collections," Marta told her one evening, watching Arya extract a 6-month overdue payment from a lordling who had been dodging them for a year. "You've got the face of a poet and the instincts of a loan shark. It's unsettling." "Thank you," Arya said, genuinely meaning it. It was Marta who pointed her toward the university. "You read everything that isn't nailed down," the old vampire observed, gesturing at the stack of borrowed books that had taken over Arya's desk. "Go get someone to pay you for it." She enrolled at the University of Ashenmere under a false identity. Arya Marin, mature student, interests in political history and economic theory, and discovered that the part of her mind the Valamont court had dismissed as clever was in fact genuinely brilliant. She devoured knowledge with a desperate thirst, studying strategy, politics, economics, military history, diplomatic theory, and, on one memorable occasion, an elective course in ancient poetry that made her cry for 3 straight days, and was, she later decided, the most useful thing she'd ever studied. You could not understand power until you understood what people loved. She finished her studies in a third of the expected time, wrote a thesis on trade route economics that her professor called the most terrifying piece of academic writing I have ever read, and was offered a position as a lecturer. She declined. She had not spent 5 years learning how power worked in order to teach about it from behind a podium. She became a consultant instead, a quiet, discreet advisor to minor courts and merchant houses who needed someone who could see 3 moves ahead. She was good at it, frighteningly good. She had the rare combination of a strategist's mind and a survivor's instincts, and she had one advantage that no amount of education could replace. She knew, from personal and excruciating experience, exactly what happened when powerful people chose pride over pragmatism. The pain did not disappear. It simply changed shape. In the early years, it was a knife, sudden, sharp, triggered by small things. A man's laugh that sounded like his, a scent of lilies, the color of storm-gray eyes in a stranger's face. She would freeze, the air knocked from her lungs, and for a moment she would be back in that hall, searching for a face that would not turn towards her. Later, it became a dull, chronic ache, like an old war wound that throbbed before rain. She learned that the opposite of love wasn't hate, it was indifference. And she cultivated indifference like a rare and delicate flower, watering it with work, with ambition, with the quiet satisfaction of becoming someone that the girl in the wedding dress could never have imagined. She did not look for love. She did not trust it. Love, in her experience, was a beautiful room with a locked door and no windows. So naturally, love came looking for her instead. And it arrived, as most truly important things do, in a deeply undignified fashion. It was in the winter court of Prince Arundel, lord of the frost-bitten Ashvale territories, 97 years after she had walked out of Damien's palace, that she met him. Emperor Dmitry Volkov of the Northern Voron had not come to the Ashvale court to find a wife, a partner, or anything remotely romantic. He had come to negotiate a trade treaty for Chris Orr, and he was in a spectacularly foul mood about it, because his own economists had, in his words, produced projections so optimistic they bordered on fantasy literature. Arya was there, advising Prince Arundel on the history of Voron expansionism, because the prince was 200 years old, had the strategic instincts of a particularly sheltered house cat, and would have signed away half his treasury if left unsupervised. She was introduced to the emperor not as a potential conquest or a decorative object, but as the scholar Arya, the one who keeps telling me I'm going to go bankrupt, in the prince's cheerfully oblivious words. Dmitry Volkov was tall, with hair the color of polished silver, and eyes a startling pale blue, like glacial ice. He had the build of a man who still trained with his soldiers every morning, and the bearing of someone who had precisely zero patience for small talk. When he looked at her, he did not assess her beauty or her breeding. He looked at her as if he were reading a fascinating and potentially dangerous text. "The prince tells me you are an expert on my people," Dmitry said, his voice a low baritone, with none of the lilting, aristocratic cadence she associated with courts. It was direct, solid, and faintly annoyed, like a man who had been arguing with spreadsheets all day. "He also tells me you advised him against 3 of my key proposals." "I advised him that those 3 proposals would lead to the economic ruin of his kingdom within 50 years, Arya replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Your projections for Chris Orr yields are optimistic." A lesser ruler would have been offended. Dmitry laughed. It was a real sound, deep and unforced, and it startled her. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was warm. "Optimistic," he repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. "My own economists called them aggressively speculative. I prefer your word. It is more diplomatic." He paused. "I fired those economists, by the way." "All of them?" "All of them. I am now in the uniquely humiliating position of negotiating a trade treaty with projections I know are wrong, but haven't had time to fix." So, he pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, uninvited, with the casual authority of a man who was accustomed to sitting wherever he pleased. "Tell me exactly how wrong I am. I have all evening, and I would rather hear it from someone competent than discover it the expensive way." They spoke for 5 hours. Not of love or pleasantries, but of history and power, of trade routes and military strategy, of grain yields and border economics. She challenged his assumptions. He parried with keen insights of his own. He did not flatter her. He did not defer to her. He argued with her, genuinely, passionately, with the ferocity of a man who cared more about being right than being comfortable. 3 times she proved him wrong with data, and 3 times he conceded with the same phrase. "Fair point. Continue." No man had ever said fair point to her in a room full of people. It was, she would later reflect, the most romantic thing anyone had ever done. He sought her out again the next day. He arrived at her study carrying 2 books, a first edition Vorin economic history and a collection of northern folk tales. He held them out like a man offering tools, not gifts. "The history, so you can correct me with primary sources instead of secondary ones," he said. "The folk tales, because you mentioned you've never been north of the Thornwall, and a person cannot understand a people without understanding what stories they tell their children." On the 3rd day, he invited her to observe his strategic council. Not as a guest, as a participant. His generals eyed her with suspicion until she pointed out a flaw in their proposed supply chain that would have left their eastern garrison without food for 6 weeks. The room went very quiet. Dmitri's chief general, a scarred Vorin woman named Katya, stared at her for a long moment, then turned to the emperor and said, "Where did you find this one?" "She found me," Dmitri said simply. "Or rather, she found my mistakes. Same thing." He did not court her with jewels or promises. He courted her with problems. He would bring her maps, intelligence reports, economic projections, and say, "What am I not seeing?" And when she told him, he listened. Not with the patient tolerance of a man humoring a woman, but with the fierce attention of a strategist who recognized a superior mind when he encountered one. She learned about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking it. He was ruthless in negotiation, but fair in governance. He trained with his soldiers in freezing rain because he refused to ask them to do anything he wouldn't. He had a dry, understated wit that surfaced at unexpected moments. Once, during a particularly heated debate about taxation policy, he turned to her and said, with perfect deadpan, "I liked you better when you agreed with me." And she had laughed so hard she'd knocked over an inkwell and ruined a treaty draft. He'd helped her mop it up, and she'd noticed his hands were shaking slightly from suppressed laughter, and something in her chest had cracked open, something she had thought was sealed shut forever. He learned her story in pieces too, not because he demanded it, but because she eventually felt safe enough to offer it. It came out on a winter evening, 3 months into their acquaintance, in his study over a shared bottle of northern blackberry wine. She told him about Damien, about the wedding, about the words that had broken her. Her voice was steady. She told it as history, not heartbreak. She had told this story to herself so many times that the edges were smooth. Dmitri listened in silence. When she finished, he did not offer pity. He did not reach for her hand or murmur soft sympathies. His glacial eyes went hard, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. "He had a queen in his hands," Dmitri said, his voice quiet with a cold, controlled fury. "And he let her go, because he feared the whispers of fools. His kingdom deserves to wither." He paused, then added with a faint grimace, "Also, we will take such care of you." That's how they did it? Not even honest enough to be openly cruel? He shook his head. "My grandmother insulted people to their faces. She considered anything else a waste of everyone's time." Arya surprised herself by smiling. A real smile. The moment it became something more than respect was small and unplanned. They were in his war room 6 months after they'd met, bent over maps of a disputed border territory. It was 2 in the morning. They had been arguing about troop placements for 3 hours. Empty cups of tea littered the table. At some point, without either of them noticing, his hand had come to rest on the small of her back as they leaned over the same map. It was not a romantic gesture. It was the unconscious intimacy of 2 people who had forgotten where one ended and the other began. She noticed it first. She went still, and he felt the change, and he looked at her. She looked at him. The map of the eastern border was suddenly very, very unimportant. "I should mention," he said, his voice rougher than usual, his hand not moving, "that I have been trying very hard not to do this for approximately 4 months." "You are the Emperor of the North," she said. "I assumed self-restraint was a professional requirement." "It is. I'm failing at it." "I noticed." Is that a problem? She considered the question with the same careful analysis she applied to everything. She thought about the locked room, the beautiful prison of love she had barely survived. She thought about trust and how it was not a feeling but a series of small, verifiable actions accumulated over time. She thought about 6 months of fair point, continue, and what am I not seeing? And a man who brought her problems instead of promises. No, she said, it's not a problem. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the desperate, intoxicating kisses of her youth. It was steady, it was certain. It tasted like cold tea and blackberry wine, and the quiet, terrifying thrill of choosing to trust someone again. For the record, he murmured against her lips, I still think my troop placement is correct. For the record, she murmured back, it absolutely is not, and I will prove it to you tomorrow. I look forward to it. When he finally asked her to come with him to his capital in the north, it was not as a concubine or a guest. I need a partner, he said, his voice raw with a sincerity that had no polish, no performance. My empire is vast, but my council is old. They see the world that was. You see the world that is, and the world that could be. I don't want you to stand behind my throne, Arya. I want you to stand beside it. She went with him. Not because she loved him, not yet, not the way love would come to mean between them, but because she trusted him. And trust, she had learned, was the only foundation that didn't crack. His capital, Valenhall, was nothing like the decadent, sun-drenched marble of Damien's city. It was a fortress of dark granite and weirwood, built into the side of a mountain, stark and beautiful and immensely strong. His court was not filled with sycophantic peacocks. It was made of generals, scholars, engineers, and spy masters, creatures of purpose who judged you not by your blood, but by your usefulness. Arya was useful. In her first year, she restructured the Empire's grain distribution network, preventing a famine in the Western territories. The solution was unglamorous: a series of regional storage depots and a revised transport schedule that her logistics team privately called the Arya Grid, but it saved 40,000 lives. She celebrated by sleeping for 14 hours and then getting into a 3-hour argument with Dmitri about tax reform. In her third year, her network of informants, built from the connections she'd made during her years as a consultant, her time with Marta's consortium, and a natural talent for making people feel safe enough to talk, gave them a critical advantage in a border dispute with the Kale Dominion, a loose confederation of common-blood vampire clans who had been raiding their western frontier for decades. She identified the real grievance behind the raids, a contaminated blood spring, not territorial aggression, negotiated a resource-sharing accord, and turned a potential war into a trade partnership. General Katya, who had been sharpening her sword with visible enthusiasm, was simultaneously impressed and disappointed. You've just cost me a perfectly good war, Katya told her, without rancor. I've saved you 6,000 soldiers, Arya replies. I know. That's why I'm only moderately furious. In her 5th year, she negotiated a treaty with the ancient Nighthollow Coven, a reclusive order of vampire mystics who had retreated into the deep forests 3 centuries ago and refused to speak with anyone who smelled of politics. No Volkov emperor had managed to draw them out in 500 years. The Nighthollow were notoriously impossible to deal with. They found court logic tedious, military logic vulgar, and the concept of urgency a sign of poor planning. Arya succeeded because she stopped trying to negotiate like an empress and started listening like a scholar. She spent 3 weeks in their forest sanctuary, drank things she preferred not to identify, survived a welcoming trial that was either a test of character or an elaborate practical joke, she was never entirely sure, and emerged with a trade agreement, a Nighthollow emissary, and a newfound appreciation for fermented bloodroot wine. How? Dmitri asked, genuinely baffled when she returned. I asked them what they wanted instead of telling them what we needed, she said. Apparently, that's never occurred to anyone before. That's absurdly simple. Most good strategies are. The hard part is being willing to shut up long enough to hear the answer. He looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize, a mixture of admiration, amusement, and something deeper and more private. He reached out and pulled a thorn from her cloak, a relic of the Night Hollow forest. "You have a thorn in your cloak," he said. Very diplomatic. "It's a gift. The Night Hollow emissary pinned it there. It's a sign of respect." "It's a thorn." "You are impossible." "And yet, here you are." "Here I am," she agreed and smiled. Dmitri gave her full credit for every success. He called her his empress in all but name, his partner in rule. The court followed his lead. They called her Lady Arya, the Emperor's wisdom, the shadow hand of the North. They respected her. Some even feared her. No one ever dared to care for her. Their love grew the way the northern forests grew, slowly, stubbornly, in conditions that would kill anything less resilient. It was expressed not in grand declarations, but in daily acts of trust. In the way he sought her hand under the council table during tense negotiations, a silent, "I'm here." In the way she left annotated books on his desk, with notes in the margins, that were half strategic insight and half dry commentary. "Dmitri, this chapter on Vorin inheritance law is both relevant to our current dispute and the most boring thing I have ever read. I have summarized the key points on page 4. You're welcome." In the way they argued, fiercely, honestly, without cruelty, and emerged on the other side of every disagreement with a better plan than either had started with. He had never given her a throne. He had helped her build one. Then, 150 years after she had vanished into the night, the South came looking for her. The news arrived first as whispers from her informants, then as official reports from their southern border agents. The kingdom of Valamont was dying. Queen Rose had spent the decades after Arya's departure tightening her grip on the old houses, purging anyone who whispered that perhaps the king's marriage to a common blood hadn't been the catastrophe she'd predicted. Because, of course, it hadn't been the marriage that was the catastrophe. It was the divorce. The very Sunstone clans that Lord Aldrich had mocked at the wedding reception, Arya's own distant kin, controlled the mountain passes. When Valamont needed those alliances, the clans remembered how the court had spoken of common blood. They allied with a rival kingdom instead, cutting off Valamont's most lucrative trade routes. The kingdom bled gold, like a wound that wouldn't close. Rose had died 20 years ago. Arya's informants reported that she had spent her final decade still holding court every evening in the Great Hall, still immaculately dressed, still issuing quiet directives to houses that had stopped listening years before. She died in her chair, mid-sentence, and it took the attendants several minutes to notice because her posture hadn't changed. Even in death, her composure was flawless. Arya read the report and felt nothing, which was its own kind of epitaph. Vespera presided over what remained, a court that still performed the rituals of power without possessing any. The great houses that Rose had so fiercely curated were insular and calcified, their politics as inbred as their bloodlines, their brilliance long since refined into something brittle. And Damien? Damien had spent 150 years being haunted, not by a ghost, but by an absence, by the memory of a woman in a linen shift walking out of his life with more dignity in her bare feet than his entire court possessed in their velvet slippers. He had sent scouts to find her within a month of her departure, not to bring her back by force, but to know she was safe. They had lost her trail within a week. She had vanished utterly, the way only someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove can vanish. For 100 years, he told himself she would come back. She would cool down, see reason, understand the impossible position he'd been in. She would return, and he would make it right. It was the most pathetic kind of hope, the hope of a man who could not conceive of a world in which he was not the center of someone else's story. By the time he heard the name the Emperor's Wisdom and understood who she was, the gap between them had become an ocean. She was no longer a wounded bride. She was the co-ruler of the most powerful empire in the North, architect of its greatest diplomatic triumphs, and, this was the part that truly destroyed him, visibly, unmistakably happy. His spies reported it with a kind of bewildered reverence. She laughed in council meetings. She argued with the emperor in public, and neither of them stormed off. She was beloved by the people. She had built everything he had told her they would build together, and she had built it with someone else. Arya read the reports of Valamon's decline in her study, a room of dark wood and flickering candlelight, the howl of the northern wind a familiar song outside her window. She felt a distant, clinical sense of detachment. It was like reading the history of a foreign land, a cautionary footnote in someone else's textbook. The girl who would have wept for that kingdom was long dead. One evening, Dmitri entered her study. He held a sealed scroll, the wax bearing the crest of the Valamont dynasty, a swooping falcon over a bed of thorns. His face was grim. "An envoy has arrived from the south," he said, his voice low. "From him. He requests an audience." Arya looked up from her maps, her heart giving a single, hard thud against her ribs. It wasn't pain. It was the turning of a great wheel. The final chapter of a book she had closed long ago, now demanding to be read. "Not an envoy," she said, her voice calm. "He will send a formal delegation first, to test the waters. They will be refused. Then he will send a personal plea, likely through his sister. That will also be refused. Only when he is truly desperate, when he feels he has no other choice, will he come himself." Dmitri watched her, his glacial eyes searching her face. "And what will you do when he does?" "I will see him," she said. "I will let him come to my home. I will let him stand in my court. And I will let him ask." She turned to face Dmitri, her expression serene. "And then I will give him my answer." A pause. "Do you need me there?" he asked. It was not jealousy, it was an offer. The simple readiness of a partner who would stand beside her if she needed it, or step back if she didn't. "No," she said gently. "This is an old ghost. I'd like to lay it to rest myself." He nodded once. "Then I will be in the war room. If you need me, send word. If he is rude to you, send guards." She smiled. "And if he's merely pathetic, then send wine. You'll need it afterward." He came, just as she had predicted. First, the formal delegation, 4 lords in velvet carrying a scroll of diplomatic pleasantries so ornate it practically genuflected, who were politely but firmly turned away at the gates of Valenhall. Then came Vespera, older and harder, requesting an audience with "my dear sister-in-law, whom we miss terribly," in a tone that suggested she missed Arya the way one misses a persistent headache. She was kept waiting in a snow-clogged mountain pass for 3 days before being sent back south with a single, unsigned note that contained nothing but a detailed, meticulously sourced report on the current market price of grain in her brother's starving kingdom. Arya had spent an enjoyable afternoon composing that report. She considered it one of her finest works. Finally, 2 months later, Damien Valmont arrived. He did not come with the arrogance of a king, but with the haggard humility of a man who had finally run out of alternatives. He had a small retinue, and he waited at the gates for a full day before he was granted permission to enter. Arya chose the setting for their meeting with care, not the grand throne room, where he might feel he was addressing a fellow monarch. She received him in the great library of Valenhall, her personal domain. It was a cavernous space, the walls lined from floor to ceiling with scrolls and books, the air smelling of old paper and wood smoke. It was a place of knowledge and quiet power. Her power. She was seated at a large weirwood table, reviewing territorial maps with 2 of her most trusted strategists, when he was announced. She did not rise. She simply looked up as he was escorted in, and dismissed her strategists with a quiet nod. The years had not been kind to him. The timeless, arrogant beauty she remembered was still there, but it was frayed at the edges. There were new lines of strain around his eyes, a weariness in his posture that spoke of decades spent watching something precious slip through his fingers. He looked like a king who was losing. He was dressed in somber black, the color of mourning, and she wondered if he'd chosen it on purpose. He stopped a few feet from her table, his stormy gray eyes fixing on her. He seemed to drink her in, The simple but elegant gown of dark northern wool, the silver signet ring of the emperor's hand on her finger, the calm, unreadable expression on her face. This was not the wounded girl he had last seen in a linen shift, barefoot and trembling. This was a different creature entirely, and the recognition of that carved fresh lines of regret into his face. "Arya," he breathed, his voice rough. "King Valamont," she replied, her tone polite, formal, and as cold as the winter outside. "You have traveled a long way. I trust the journey was not too arduous." The pleasantry was a dismissal of any past intimacy, and it landed like a physical blow. He flinched. "Please," he said, taking a hesitant step forward. "Can we dispense with the formalities? I have not come here as a king." "Then as what have you come?" "As a man," he said, his voice cracking. "As the man who lost you. The man who was a fool, the greatest fool in the long, sad history of our kind." He looked around the library at the testament to her new life, and his expression filled with a bitter, disbelieving awe. This is what you have built. I heard the stories, but I could not imagine." "You have a poor imagination, Damien," she said, the use of his name a deliberate, clinical strike. "You could not imagine your bride would have a spine. You could not imagine your kingdom would need more than a pure bloodline to survive. You have always been limited by what you could see from your throne." His face crumpled. The mask of a king fell away, revealing the desperate, ruined man beneath. "I was wrong," he whispered, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. "Gods, Arya, I know that. I have known it every single day for 150 years. Every morning I wake in that cold, empty bed, and the first thing I think of is your face. The way you looked at me in that hall, waiting. And I did nothing." He met her eyes, and she saw the raw, gaping wound of his regret. It was real. She had to grant him that. It was a deep and genuine pain. A younger Arya would have been moved by it, but the woman she was now simply observed it as a fact. A data point, notable but no longer actionable. "My mother is dead," he said, his voice flat. "She died 20 years ago, still sitting in her chair, still giving orders to an empty room. Vespera holds what's left, which isn't much. The houses my mother spent her life cultivating, they've turned inward, brittle. And the Sunstone clans, your people, Arya, they hold the passes now, and they will not treat with us. We dismissed them. We dismissed you. Our treasury is hemorrhaging. My kingdom is dying." He took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I am not here to ask for an alliance for my kingdom. I am here to ask for you. Come back. Come back to me. I will name you Queen Regnant. You will have absolute power. My court will bow to you. I will spend every day for the rest of eternity making it up to you. I love you, Arya. I never stopped." The words hung in the silent air between them. "I love you." The phrase that had once been the center of her universe. Now it sounded like a foreign language, the meaning lost in a poor translation. She allowed the silence to stretch, to become a weapon in itself. She watched him crumble under its weight, his hope visibly draining away with every passing second. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it filled the vast library. Each word a perfectly polished stone, dropped into a deep well. "Love," she said, tasting the word. "You speak of love. Let me tell you what I have learned of love, Damien. Love is not a word whispered in the dark. It is an action taken in the light. Love is not a feeling. It is a choice. Every single day." She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and unhurried, and walked around the table until she stood directly in front of him. She was close enough to see the silver threads in his dark hair, the desperation etched into his face. "Dmitri has never once told me that he loves me in so many words," she said softly. He flinched as if she had struck him. He has not needed to. He shows me every day. He shows me when he listens to my counsel, even when it contradicts his own. He shows me when he trusts me with the lives of his people. He shows me when he looks at me not as a possession to be guarded, but as a partner to be cherished. Her voice was steady, clear, merciless. He crowned me his equal from the first breath we shared, not with gold, but with respect. That is love, Damien. A quiet, sturdy thing that builds empires. She looked at him, her eyes holding no anger, no hatred. There was nothing left to burn. There was only the cold, clear truth. The love you offer is a desperate apology, a retroactive cure for a fatal wound. You want me to come back and save your kingdom. You want me to fix the mistake you made 150 years ago, when you sat in your mother's chambers and agreed. Don't deny it, Damien. I've had a century and a half to work it out. That your bride would be decorative. You don't love me, Damien. You love the idea of my forgiveness. You love what I can do for you. No, he choked out. That's not true. Isn't it? She asked, her voice gentle, which was somehow more devastating than a shout. You had a wife, Damien. You had her love, her loyalty, her future. And you stood by in silence while your family shredded her for their own amusement. You let them humiliate your wife. She paused, letting the memory of that night settle over them like a shroud. So I let history humiliate your bloodline. The color drained from his face. The finality in her words was absolute. This was not a negotiation. This was a verdict. 150 years, she continued, her voice as calm and inevitable as a glacier. That is how long you waited. Not because you were searching for me. Your scouts lost my trail in a week, Damien. A girl in a stolen servant's cloak, and your entire intelligence apparatus couldn't find her. You waited because you believed I would come back on my own. You waited because you could not fathom a world in which I did not need you. She tilted her head, studying him the way she might study a particularly tragic passage in a history book. That is not love. That is entitlement wearing love's clothes. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. Your lineage will fade into a footnote in the histories my scholars will write, she said. Your kingdom will be a cautionary tale about the cost of pride. And I will be here, building a dynasty with a man who understands that a throne is just a chair, but a partnership is a living, breathing empire. She turned away from him then, her back to him, and walked towards the fire that crackled in the hearth. The gesture was a mirror of his own, all those years ago in the bridal chamber. A dismissal. An ending. She wondered if he recognized it. By the sharp intake of breath behind her, he did. Guards, she called out, her voice ringing with an authority he had never allowed her. Escort King Valamont from the library. His audience is concluded. She heard his shattered gasp behind her, the soft shuffle of his feet as the guards came to lead him away. She did not turn. She did not watch him leave. She simply stared into the flames, listening as the sound of his footsteps faded down the long hall, disappearing from her life for the last time. She stood there for a long time, watching the fire dance and sway. She felt no triumph, no joy in his destruction, only a profound, quiet sense of closure. The ghost of the girl who had loved a weak king had finally been laid to rest. The door to the library opened softly. She didn't need to turn to know it was Dmitri. He came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort in the immense silence. He didn't speak. He just took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was calloused from holding a sword, yet his touch was gentle. It is done, she whispered, her gaze still on the flames. How are you? He asked. She considered the question carefully, because he deserved a real answer. Lighter, she said. Like putting down something I didn't realize I was still carrying. A pause. Was he very pathetic? Extremely. Shall I send wine? She turned her head to look at him, at his strong, kind face, at the glacial eyes that held a universe of respect for her. and a small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that evening. It felt like the sun rising after a long, dark night. "Send tea," she said, "and those maps of the eastern watershed. I had an idea about the irrigation problem while I was being dramatically resolute, and I'd like to work it out before I forget." He stared at her for a moment, then shook his head with an expression of profound and helpless admiration. "You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met." "Thank you." It was not entirely a compliment. "And yet, here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. Together they turned from the fire and walked back towards the table, back to the maps spread out under the lamplight, back to the future they were building together. His kingdom was a memory of ashes and regret. Hers was an empire of granite and starlight, just beginning. Some thrones are a birthright, inherited and defended. But the greatest thrones, the ones that endure, are the ones that are earned. And hers had been earned the moment she chose to walk away from one, leaving it empty, to crumble into dust behind her. Some kingdoms are built on blood, others on gold. The rarest are built on the radical, terrifying act of knowing your own worth and refusing to accept a single thing less.